Hi, everybody. It's Jay, and I am back in the booth with you for another sneak peek video preview for this week's new release here on Say with Jay. Our new release this week is Just a Cowboy's Happy Ever After. It is the 13th and final entry into Jessie Gussman's Flyboys of Sweet Briar Ranch Western Sweet Romance series, and I don't know that I've ever had quite this combination of sadness and excitement over a new release before. Obviously, the sadness is because an absolutely fantastic series is coming to a close, but I'm also beyond excited about this story. I can't quit being a fanboy about it. It's that good. Now, I know I tend to be prone to hyperbole on occasion, but I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say this very well could be the best or one of the best books Jessie has ever written. It gripped me from the moment I picked it up to start reading it until the time I put it down, and I think you're going to feel the same way. I hope you do anyway. But, as always, I'll have a little bit more about the story and a live reading for you in just a bit. But it is time once again for a segment that we like to call Cooking with Jay. For everyone who's not seen these videos before, Jessie has been including in these books in this series and the ones previous a dish, and I make it for you here. And today's dish, well, it comes very early on in the book, and the book opens with a funeral. And in many small towns, a funeral can become an occasion for the community or the congregation of the church to have a celebration of the person who's passed, but have a celebration in general and a time to get together and fellowship and all that. And you can't do that without good food. You can't have a church dinner of any kind without some good desserts. And that's what we're going to make for you here today. 7-layer magic bars. Now, this has always been one of my favorite desserts growing up, but I have to kind of complain a little because this whole recipe has 8 ingredients, and one of those, 7 ingredients, and an optional 8th. So I don't know where all 7 layers come from. Maybe you can help me with the origin of the name and tell me where the 7 layers are, or maybe if there's one that's gotten omitted over time, what that layer might be. But we'd love to hear from you in the comments. But it's an absolutely fantastic dessert, and it is surprisingly easy to make. So sit back, enjoy, and let us make some 7-layer magic bars for you. As always, the ingredients, and because this is a fairly short recipe, I'll have the entire recipe as well down for you in the description of the video. You might have to hit see all or show more or whatever it says on your particular device, but it'll be there so you don't have to worry about trying to capture all this in real time. Anyway, without further ado, here are 7-layer magic bars. Okay, to start with, let's take a look at the ingredients. As I said, there are only 7 of them with an optional 8th. For this recipe, you're going to need 2 cups of graham cracker crumbs. Now, of course, you can always crumble your own graham crackers, but I'm a busy man and don't have time for that, so I just buy the crumbs pre-crumbled. You're going to need 1/2 cup of melted, unsalted butter. You're going to need a 14-ounce can of sweetened condensed milk, 1 cup of semi-sweet chocolate chips, 1 cup of butterscotch chips, 1 cup of chopped pecans, and 1 cup of shredded sweetened coconut. The optional ingredient that I was mentioning is 1 teaspoon of flaky sea salt, like Maldon salt. The first thing you're going to want to do is to preheat your oven to 350 degrees. Next, take a 9 by 13-inch baking pan. If it's not nonstick, spray it with some nonstick cooking oil. But pro tip here, I'll show you in a bit why you do it, but I would strongly suggest lining your pan with parchment paper. Next, in a bowl, take your 2 cups of graham cracker crumbs and add your 1/2 cup of melted butter. Using a fork, you want to blend that really well, get those crumbs nice and coated with the butter through and through, make sure there aren't any big clumps, make sure there's no dry crumbs stuck to the side of the bowl. Next, dump those buttered crumbs into the middle of your pan and spread them out across the pan in an even layer. And you want to use either your fingers or the back of a flat-bottomed cup to really press them into the pan, firm that crust up. For me, I found the combination of the parchment paper and the butter in the crumbs to not make the glass work so well. The crumbs were sticking to the bottom of the glass and coming off, so I wound up doing this with my fingers and the palms of my hand and so forth. But the point is, you really want to get those crumbs pressed down nice and firm. Once you have that done, you want to spread your sweetened condensed milk over the crust and then use a spatula to gently spread it out to the edges of the crust. And you do want to do this gently so that you're not pulling up the crust with the condensed milk. So take your time and do this very gently. Once you have your condensed milk spread out, you want to first sprinkle on your chocolate chips, then sprinkle on your butterscotch chips. Next, sprinkle on your pecans. Now, full disclosure here, I have one of the people in my house who may or may not be directly related to me who doesn't like pecans. So I'm only putting pecans on roughly half of this. And that's actually a great example. If there's one of these ingredients you don't like, feel free to leave it out. This is yours. Customize it like you like. But after the pecans, then add your layer of sweetened coconut over the top of everything else. Once you get all the layers on, then gently press the ingredients down so that they stick in the condensed milk. Once that's done, then it is time to put it in your oven, your preheated 350-degree oven, for 30 to 35 minutes. You want to just bake these until they start to turn golden brown. And this is what they look like when they come out of the oven. Now comes the hard part, the waiting. By the way, if you are going to add the optional sea salt, now would be the time to sprinkle it on. Once you do that, you're going to want to let these bars cool completely. And we're talking about probably a couple of hours. And you might have to do like I did with this very batch and stand guard and threaten people within an inch of their life if they touch them. Hopefully violence won't be necessary. Now, once they are cooled completely, here's the cool reason for using the parchment paper. As you can see, when they're cool, you can grasp both sides of the parchment paper and simply lift the bars out to cut. The reason you would do this is you never want to risk ruining a nice nonstick pan by scratching it up with a knife. Once you have them cut, store them in an airtight container with wax paper or parchment paper between any layers of the bars that you have. And, ladies and gentlemen, here is the finished product. It is so good with the blending of all the flavors that you've used. Sadly, this particular sample did not last much longer than it took for me to turn off the camera. And that is how you make 7-layer magic bars. I hope you guys will try it, and if you do, please let us know how it goes down in the comments. And if you figure out what the 7 layers are supposed to be, please let me know. Okay, let's talk a little bit about this week's new release, Just a Cowboy's Happy Ever After. Now, before I start talking about the book proper, I wanted to say something that I really admire about Jessie's writing, and I've mentioned this before, is the way she world builds. What I mean by that is that you feel a real sense of community within a series that she does. You know, you'll have people that appear in the first book that continue to appear, and people that come and go and pop in and out, but it feels like a cohesive world. And especially in her Sweetwater, North Dakota books, and there have been 3 different series now, you'll see that same thing. People going in between the different series. One person who has done that consistently is the heroine of this book, Lark Stryker. We actually first meet Lark in the original Sweetwater series where she is a teenage girl. And one thing that I just have to fanboy over is one particular scene in that original Sweetwater series, and I think it is the Cowboy's bargain bride, but don't quote me on that. There's a scene in that book that actually continues in this book. Was that 68, 69, 70 books later? If you are familiar with all of the Sweetwater books, you'll know it. But anyway, like I said, I just think that is incredible. But let's talk about this book. It's the story of, as I said, Lark Stryker and Jeb Malone. We learn way back in that first Sweetwater series that Lark works for Jeb on his dairy farm. And we also learn way back then that Lark is kind of smitten with him. But as time goes on through the different series, Lark grows to adulthood. She becomes a veterinarian there in Sweetwater. And she is alone. She's single. And we're left to wonder what happened between her and Jeb. Well, no more. This is their story. And it is one that is told in an incredibly emotional way. And so I don't want to spoil any of it. I will say that it starts with a funeral. The funeral for Jeb's wife. Soon after that, it jumps back in time to tell us the whole story of Lark and Jeb's relationship and what happened. So, again, I won't give any more than that, but for now, here is a live preview reading of a scene from Just a Cowboy's Happy Ever After. I do hope you enjoy it, and then come back this Friday for the full release, which also happens to be the book release day in the Kindle store. But come back this Friday for the full release here on Say with Jay. Jeb stood straight and tall beside the casket. It was the least he could do for Donna, who maybe hadn't been so good to him, but who had given him the ability to be good to the woman he loved. Of course, he'd made a much bigger sacrifice than he originally intended when she first asked him to marry her. Their marriage had lasted a lot longer than it was supposed to, since Donna had lived a lot longer than she originally thought she was going to. When they first got married, Jeb had wondered if that had been a deliberate deceit, but after 17 years, he was fairly certain it wasn't so. It wasn't like he could blame her for what happened. He jerked his head at another well-wisher. Donna had gotten her wishes, all of them. He had seen to it, keeping his word. None of that would have been possible without his sacrifice, though. Of course, Donna had allowed him to use her money, although he'd only used it for two things. His farm was paid for because of Donna, and he'd kept his promise to Clay Stryker. He wasn't sure he would have married Donna otherwise. More well-wishers, more head-nodding, and the occasional thank you. Jeb stood with his jaw set, his feet planted. Crowds were not his thing. He hated standing up in front of everyone, hated having their eyes on him, hated being where everyone could see him. He'd much rather be wearing his old blue jeans and work boots and be out with his cows, driving a tractor in a field somewhere. But there were occasions in a man's life where he had to do what needed to be done, and he didn't have a choice. Funerals were one of those things. At least Donna had given specific instructions for what she wanted, so there was nothing left for him to do other than attend and make sure her wishes were carried out for the last time. After the service, the casket would be wheeled out and taken to the graveyard. She didn't want people following and had specifically requested that there be a meal afterward instead, while they laid her in the ground and covered her up. In the meantime, Jeb would have to eat, have to be in the same room with Lark. He'd managed to avoid her since that fateful day when she asked him to marry her, and he'd had no choice but to turn her down. What other answer could a 30-year-old man give an 18-year-old girl? It was the only answer that made sense, even though it wasn't the answer he wanted to give. He might have answered differently, even still, but he'd given Clay his word. Plus, tongues already wagged about her working for him, and if they ended up getting married, they'd want to know what all had been happening while she had been underage on his farm. He didn't really want those questions, even though he was completely innocent and could answer everything honestly, by the grace of God. Even now, the hairs on the back of his neck tingled, despite the fact that he couldn't see her, hadn't seen her since he glanced back and saw her walking up the aisle, wearing a dark green dress with black trim, the waist nipped in, emphasizing her slimness, flaring out around her hips, twirling and teasing slim ankles with each step she took. He was used to seeing her in blue jeans and a t-shirt, except for that white dress, the one that floated through his dreams, the one that made his heart lodge in his throat and his normally slow tongue tie itself in knots. He was just as bad now. It was like he hadn't matured at all. "We're ready to begin the service whenever you are, Mr. Malone." The pastor spoke low and respectfully beside him, making Jeb's head jerk. He'd been deep in thought, but not about his wife. He nodded his head, never able to get his tongue to work the way he wanted to, and took a last look at the woman he'd been married to for the last decade and a half. He hadn't expected to be married more than 6 months, and yet somehow 17 years had gone by. He regretted it, regretted most of it, But it was too late, and he wouldn't want Donna to know how much he wished he had said no when she had made her offer. So what if he had lost the farm? Of course, Lark wouldn't be a vet now, and from everything that he'd heard, she was a great one and quite happy without him. So maybe he would do it all again. With a last look at Donna, he nodded for the ushers to close the casket lid, and without a backward glance, Jeb went over and sat down. It wasn't the woman in the casket he was thinking of. It was the woman halfway back, in the dark green dress, with the straight back and the long mane of hair trailing down behind her. Once upon a time, she'd been young, and so had he. Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out the playlist with all our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.